this is the Witness for Jesus channel. Welcome to this week's Midweek Meeting Gold for the dates 15th to the 21st of February 2021. This week we're going to discuss some of the deeper things we can glean from Numbers 3 and 4. Some real gems here, you'll love it. Plus the annual service report and some gold nuggets from our study of Ezekiel as it relates to the Pure Worship book. Now, the outline gives us some interesting facts from Numbers 3 and 4. Another point I'd like to make is that we know that Israel at this time in their history were nomadic, and that's why they had instructions for setting up the camp and for transporting the tabernacle. It's interesting that God's people literally carried the tabernacle where the presence of God dwelled, and we know that in the Greek scriptures, Christians themselves are spoken of as being the temple of the Spirit of God. Effectively, where the Israelites carried the temple around in the world, we carry God's presence around in the world also. That's an interesting point. Now here's something else that I found really fascinating about Numbers chapter 4 actually. Something interesting about the symbolism of the covers for the Ark of the Covenant and the various tools. In Numbers 4 we read that these items were to be covered in a certain way for transportation. The Ark of the Covenant was to be covered with the temple curtain or veil, which we know symbolised Jesus' body and the divide between God and man. Then it was to be covered with animal skin, which denotes sacrifice, and then with a cloth of solid blue. The significance of blue in the Bible is that often it denotes heaven or God's presence. For example, in Ezekiel and other visions we see sapphires at God's throne. Of course, they're blue. And blue also denoted royalty in other scriptures. Now, all of this means that the ark, where God's presence appeared, was separated from men by the veil or the curtain, by a skin of sacrifice, and covered in a colour denoting heaven and royalty. You can look at the other items in Numbers 4 and their symbolism, as each set of items seems to have been covered in a slightly different way. For example, the items for the bread and the drink offering were to be covered with a scarlet cover, which of course puts us in mind of blood, and it fits entirely with Jesus saying that the cup was his blood of the covenant. Such a rich passage actually, if you really delve into it. So in the outline on JW.org, in Treasures from God's Word, we read a few facts about the Levites, which is more in Numbers chapter 3. The role of the Levites is likened to the Christian congregation. It says the males in Aaron's family performed priestly duties. The rest of the Levites assisted them. Likewise, in the Christian congregation today, some responsible men care for weighty spiritual concerns, while others care for necessary routine matters. I think this is an acceptable parallel. I've heard other parallels, however, to the priesthood, that is, that the role of priests in Israel prefigures the role of the 144,000 who are mentioned in Revelation. Now, of course, here we don't see that. We see a parallel to the congregation as a whole. But as you know, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that only 144,000 are kings and priests. So in one sense I can see why some would suggest that the Levites prefigure the 144,000. However, as the paragraph says, the Levites in fact can prefigure others who are not part of the 144,000. First off, not every Levite was a priest. Some Levites were not priests. What's important to note is that if you're speaking of spiritual Israel, that means that all of Israel prefigures spiritual Israel and not just the Levites. In Revelation 14, where the 144,000 and the tribes are given, the Levites are only one of the tribes mentioned, making up the 144,000. So we cannot say that the Levitical priesthood of Israel is only the 144,000. Rather, all Israel prefigure spiritual Israel. In terms of who makes up spiritual Israel? Well, that's a detailed topic, but an interesting insight is the fact that all Christians are part of the new covenant. Are you aware that JW.org says that only 144,000 Christians are part of the new covenant with Jesus as mediator? Were you aware of that? That they say that the great crowd are not part of the new covenant and don't have Jesus as mediator. I'll put a reference to that on screen. But myself, I personally, and many other Christians believe that all of us are part of the new covenant. So why would I say that? Why on earth would I say that? Well, we base this on the Greek scriptures. I'm going to give you a number of reasons here. See if you agree with me. First reason, all of Israel were part of the old Mosaic covenant, including the Gentiles who joined Israel, since they performed the covenant sign of circumcision. So if a Gentile joined Israel, they would be under the covenant. So in terms of prefiguring God's people, all of God's people were under the covenant in Israel. The second point, Jesus redeemed all mankind from the bonds of the old Mosaic covenant, and the way that he freed them from those bonds was to inaugurate the new covenant. So you cannot be set free from the old covenant if you're not a part of the new covenant. Remember, a covenant is a promise from God. It's a promise. So there cannot be Christians who've got no promise from God or no covenant. So all Christians are part of this promise, the new promise via Jesus. Now the third point here then is that the new promise or new covenant is for forgiveness of sins. So in order to be forgiven, you are clearly under the new covenant, the new promise, and the symbol of this covenant is Jesus' blood. The great crowd is shown to be under the new covenant in Revelation 7 because they washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. So therefore all Christians are under this covenant symbolised by his blood. Point 4. Prophecy indicates that all of God's people would be in the new covenant, which includes having the law written upon their hearts. Jeremiah 31 gives this prophecy and says that this is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. So the fifth reason we know that all Christians are in the new covenant is that the writer of Hebrews in chapters 8, 9 and 10 applies what Jeremiah said to the work of Jesus in his sacrifice for forgiveness of our sins. In Hebrews chapter 9, we read how Jesus went into the most holy place in heaven to offer his blood on our behalf, and the passage goes on to apply this directly to the new covenant. Clearly, the forgiveness of every Christian is included in the new covenant. Another reason, this will be the sixth reason, we know that all Christians are part of the new covenant, is that nowhere in the Greek scriptures do we read anything at all which says that some Christians are not part of it. In fact, throughout the Greek scriptures, we read how Christians are grafted into the vine of Israel and how we all have one hope with no distinction between us in terms of salvation. So bringing this back around then to the Levites. Yes, some Christians perform special duties, and yes, there is a place for the 144,000 who are mentioned in Revelation. But the entirety of Israel were under the covenant, not just the Levites, just as the entirety of Christians are under the new covenant, not just some Christians. Therefore, I disagree with the teaching of JW.org on this matter. And it's a really important point because this means, of course, that all Christians have Jesus as their mediator, as the Bible says at 1 Timothy 2 verses 5 and 6. whereas JW.org says that Jesus is only mediator for the 144,000. So moving on now. There is a 15-minute talk about the annual service report here, and I'd like to point out that this was the first time for a long time that the overall figures show that there is a worldwide decrease in Jehovah's Witnesses of minus 0.6%. But what does this really mean? Well, normal population growth worldwide is around 1.12%. This means that in any large population across many countries, you would see a 1.12% increase purely due to births. This means that the total decrease in numbers is actually 1.72% less than ordinary population growth. There has been a significant decline in numbers. In some countries, there's a drop of up to 7% in publishers. This cannot only be due to COVID and the lockdown, since, as I've said, you'd expect some growth even without any preaching at all, just due to number of births. Local to myself, it seems that some people have used the lockdown as opportunity to do their research. One Jehovah's Witness recently told me she decided to leave the organisation since she spent time doing research and watching YouTube videos. Of course, we can't believe everything on YouTube, oh no. So I always say we must check all the facts for ourselves. Check everything. You know, I was only thinking the other day how frustrating it is when you tell someone a fact and they tell you it's not true. It's frustrating, isn't it? So let's imagine a conversation. Imagine a Jehovah's Witness, for instance, saying something to someone. Let's have this conversation. The Jehovah's Witness says, "Did you know that the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, appears thousands of times in the Hebrew Scriptures?" The householder says, "No, it doesn't. The only name we have for God is Jesus." The Jehovah's Witness replies, "Actually, I can show you in the Bible where the name Jehovah appears." And the householder says, "I don't want to see your evidence because I know I'm right. Years ago I studied this, so I know I'm right. What good would it do me to see your so-called evidence?" The Jehovah's Witness says, "I'm telling you a fact. That fact is that the name for God, Yahweh or Jehovah, appears thousands of times in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm asking you to check that for yourself." And the householder says, "Nope, I'm quite happy with what I've researched, and what I've been told is correct, thank you very much, and I think you have a bad heart. You're being contentious, you're trying to debate, and you're trying to destroy my faith." Jehovah's Witness says, No, I'm not. I'm simply showing you Bible truth." And the householder replies, "I know Bible truth. Why would I want to see yours?" Can you see how frustrating that is? The householder in this scenario is being really unreasonable. Just because they think they've studied something in the past doesn't make it certainly true. If someone presents new evidence, he should listen and he should check the evidence. So what about you? If someone comes to you with evidence from the Bible itself, will you openly and honestly consider that evidence, or will you tell the person they're wrong without checking the evidence? God has told us in the Scriptures to test all things, and that's a really important point. Be like the Bereans, test all things. Don't allow anyone to stop you from looking at the facts. You never know, like the householder in my scenario, you could be mistaken. I wonder if the talk this week on the annual report will openly and clearly show that there has been a decline in numbers worldwide. And you can check the figures for yourself on jw.org. So moving on to the Pure Worship book this week, we continue looking at Ezekiel. Now I got a bit confused with this, I did at first, because it seems to jump from Ezekiel 2 right over to Ezekiel 5 and then straight over to Ezekiel 8. And it turns out that Ezekiel isn't looked at in the order you'd normally read the book. Now that's not my favourite thing, because, as I said a couple of weeks ago, reading the Bible is better reading each chapter in context, in order, in context. So, it didn't really appeal to me. But when I searched jw.org, for instance, on Ezekiel 4, having a look really about where they discuss Ezekiel 4, I found this article, which I'll show you on screen, which points to 1975 as the end. I'm sure you do already know that 1975 was a bit of a mistake made by the organisation. I just think it's interesting, though, that Ezekiel 4 was included in that reasoning. But anyway, moving on to this week's book study, the header says, I am a God who requires exclusive devotion, and the paragraph makes the point that Jehovah requires 100% devotion. He will not give his praise to another. He will not share his glory with another. So the next section points out that Ezekiel saw an idol of jealousy in the temple. The NIV Study Bible says that this idol was likely the symbol of Asherah, which agrees with the article here on JW.org, which also says this was a sacred pole. The upright pole or stake was a pagan worship symbol, which is used even today. That's because it represents the male phallus, a fertility symbol. In fact, the upright pole has been used far more in pagan worship throughout history than other symbols, like the cross, for example. If you think the cross is pagan, you should consider the evidence that the upright pole is far more obviously part of pagan worship. But that's another matter entirely, I guess. Moving on a little bit, in regard to Jehovah being a jealous God and not allowing idol worship, Jehovah said he did not create any other gods at Isaiah 43:10, didn't he? He actually said, before me there were no gods formed, and neither shall there be after me, and only he should be worshipped. So let's bring together some of the things we discussed earlier in regard to the tabernacle of God, and also this idea that God does not share his glory. And I'm going to read you a little passage by somebody who I love called Robert Bowman Jr. And this is from his Biblical Christology series. He's got a great section in there on John 1, which makes some outstanding points. So I'm going to read it to you because it links John 1 and the tabernacle. Here we go. Bowman says, the identity of this word in John 1:1 becomes clearer when John writes, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Verse 14. The word that the NIV translates made his dwelling, ekenosen, literally meant to pitch one's tent in a place, and it alludes in this context to God's dwelling among the Israelites in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was essentially a tent where God would make his presence known to the Israelites and meet with them. When the tabernacle was finished, Exodus states twice, the glory of Jehovah filled the tabernacle. Exodus 40, verses 34 and 35. John's statement in John 1:14 rather clearly echoes that climactic statement in Exodus. The word made his dwelling, ekenosen, among us, and we beheld his glory, doxon, full, pleres, of grace and truth. In Exodus it says, the glory, doxes, of the Lord, epilethe, filled the temple, askene, in Exodus 40, 34 and 35. Now these rather clear allusions to Exodus confirm that the Word who became incarnate was indeed God the Lord Yahweh. However, in this same context, John says that the Word that made his dwelling among us has the glory as of the only Son from the Father. This statement makes it clear that the divine Word was himself the Son, since the incarnation revealed the glory he already had as the Son of the Father, a point that will be reinforced later in John 17, verse 5. John describes the Son's glory as full of grace and truth. This description of the Son echoes God's description of himself to Moses, who had asked to see God's glory at the tent of meeting in Exodus 33:18. God's response was to descend in a cloud and to proclaim that he is abounding in loving kindness and truth. Exodus 34:6. What John says here must have been startling to the Jews in his day in a couple of ways. First, John is implying that the revelation of God's loving kindness or grace and of God's truth that came through Jesus superseded the revelation that came to and through Moses. John makes that plain 2 sentences later when he says, the law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, verse 17. John also makes explicit the second, even more startling implication. The revelation that Moses received of God's glory, of God himself, was only an anticipation of the revelation of God that came through his incarnate Son. John's statement, no one has ever seen God, in verse 18a, clearly recalls the Lord's statement to Moses, no man can see me and live. Now this is the end of the quote by Bowman, and I think it's very significant when we consider that Jesus was the glory of Jehovah made flesh, and he was clearly worshipped. Revelation 5 is a good example of where the Lamb is worshipped alongside the Father. So yes, Jehovah will not tolerate any idol or any worship being given to another. Yet the Father shows that not only will he tolerate worship of Jesus, but worship of Jesus is actually commanded and shown as proper in the Greek scriptures. Now you may want to check out playlists on this channel. There is a playlist called Is Jesus God, which you may like, so that'll be helpful too. We're at the end of another midweek meeting gold. Next week, no less than 2 videos for us. Whose witnesses should we be? And the memorial. There's lots more to discover next week. Please like, share and subscribe. I love you all. God bless.